Hey guys, it's Tori and today I'm going to be doing the Tudor Queens book tag. I was tagged to do this by Emily from Novell Novels. And with it being the start of Ancients-a-thon, I figured this would be a great time to do this tag since the Tudors were obviously within our large swath of time. Additionally, we're nearly done with the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, which I am hosting a read-along of with Emily from Novell Novels and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. So between those two events, I figured I may as well get this done really soon, even though usually it takes me a while to get to book tags and this one's only a couple weeks old. Again, I just feel like it's just perfect timing for me to do it. So the first question is for Katherine of Aragon, who is my favorite queen. I really love her and find her fascinating, her story to be fascinating. And the prompt for this is to choose a book that was your first true love. Now, I had a lot of options for this. I have always been a reader, so I had several books that I was thinking about. I'm not sure which one came first, but I decided to go for a book that I don't discuss very much on my channel. Again, I had a couple of options for that, but the one I ended up going with is a fairy tale retelling, and that is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. I read this in, I want to say, like early middle school and just absolutely loved it. It became one of my favorite books and series as it is part of a companion series. And honestly, it's one I need to reread. It is a retelling of the fairy tale The Goose Girl. So there is a princess who is traveling to go meet this prince that she's meant to marry, and on her way she ends up being betrayed and loses her station. And so she has to find a way to make do with life basically and decides to become a goose girl, and there's magic involved. It's beautiful, fun, great fairy tale retelling, and one that I honestly need to reread. I mean, I really should reread this whole series because it's been a very long time, but it is one that I really loved growing up. Question 2 is for Anne Boleyn, and the question is a book with a manipulative character. Now, quick little side note. While I do believe Anne Boleyn obviously was very manipulative, I don't think that's necessarily untrue. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. I feel like sometimes people give her too much credit for manipulating Henry because I feel like Henry's the king and he's clearly not afraid to do what he feels he wants to do regardless of what it may look like. And he pursued Anne Boleyn for a really long time. So I think part of that has to be obviously that she was manipulative. But I also think clearly Henry saw something in her to be willing to pursue her that long and pursue her to the point that she is able to become his new queen, that he's able to break away from the church simply to divorce his wife so that he can marry Anne Boleyn, which is just unthinkable, especially at that time. So to me, I just feel like Henry was at least smart enough, at least I would think he would be, to recognize something in Anne that he found appealing enough to make her, to do all this for her. Like, I don't think her feminine wiles or whatever would have been enough to make him dedicate as much as he did to her. I feel like he, like I said, I just feel like that gives her almost too much credit and also makes Henry look like kind of an idiot if he was willing to be dragged along that long. But I mean, like I said, she was likely very manipulative as well. I'm sure she had some power over him that she used very well. But I don't think it was all just her being manipulative. I think there was a lot more that went into it for Henry. But anyway, the question, a book with a manipulative character. I'm going to go with a book I read earlier this year that has the most disgusting manipulative character I've ever read about. When I first saw this question, I was like, which one do I want to do? What do I want to do? I can't think of one. Then I looked at my shelves and realized, oh, obviously this one, and that is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is a story following a girl, so we followed two timelines. One in 2017 when she is a grown woman, and one in 2000, early 2000s, I think. I think it starts in 1999, possibly, or maybe 2001. But anyway, early 2000s, late 90s, when she is being groomed and manipulated by her teacher. And this man is just absolutely disgusting, and it's so hard to read because you understand how she's being manipulated. Like, it's easy to understand from, like, seeing through the eyes of a 15-year-old how this man is able to seduce her and manipulate her, and he just continues to do that for so long, and it's just so uncomfortable to read. But he is very manipulative and evil and just this book is amazing. If you ever are willing to take the plunge and do it, it is very, very hard hitting though, so keep that in mind. Prompt 3 is in regards to Jane Seymour, the third wife, and the prompt is a book that delivered what you wanted, as Jane Seymour was able to deliver a son to Henry within the bonds of wedlock, which is exactly what he wanted. Jane Seymour is one that I just wish we knew more about, that I wish we had more understanding of, because I just feel like there's so much missing. She was put in a position where she had to be very careful. She had to be very meek and quiet because she had seen what had happened to his other wives who weren't, particularly Anne Boleyn. So there's a lot we just don't know about her and her mindset. We just have to do a lot of guesswork, which makes historical fiction really fun. But I also just wish we had more direct understanding of her mindset, what her fears were, what her goals were as queen. Again, we get hints of it, but between the fact that she was trying to stay in the background as much as possible and the fact that she died so early into their marriage, we just know so little about her. And she's probably the one that I wish we knew more about out of all of them. I mean, there are others we'll get to in a moment that we also don't know a ton about, but her in particular, I just feel like the way her story played out really lent itself to just very little information. But anyway, for a book that delivered what I wanted, I'm going with The Sunne in Splendour by Sharon K. Penman. I love this book. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And this book follows really the life of Richard III. I think it starts with him being 6 years old and then follows him until his death. But it's not just following his perspective, it's also following many perspectives within the Wars of the Roses. So it's just a really fleshed out look at the Wars of the Roses, primarily from the perspective of Richard III, but it really fleshes out all the figures that were involved, not just him. For those of you who've been watching me for a while, you likely know that I love Richard III. He's one of my favorite historical figures to learn about. And when I picked this up, I knew it was like a classic of Richard III historical fiction. Like, if you like Richard III, you've at least heard of this, if not read it. So I went into it with pretty high expectations, and I was not disappointed at all. It definitely delivered exactly what I wanted and more. It was just so well done. I absolutely loved it, and it's one that I will be rereading in the future despite how big it is, which usually large books, I have to know that I really love it for me to be willing to know for sure that I'll read it in the future, but this is one I know for sure I will try to get to in the future again because I just absolutely loved it. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Anne of Cleaves, and the prompt for her is to pick a book that wasn't what you expected. So like I said, the opposite of delivering what I expected, it does not. Either it surprised me by being better or worse than what I expected, or just different from what I expected. Anne of Cleaves is another one that's just fascinating to me. This prompt is based on the idea, the legend, I guess, that Henry found her not as attractive as her portrait was. But I watched an interesting video that talked about whether or not Anne of Cleves was actually that ugly, because it discusses how Henry not only saw her as a sister and made her officially known as the king's sister and treated well, she was also welcome to court. And court was a place where only the most beautiful, the most vivacious, wonderful people could be. Like, you were expected, especially as a woman, to be very attractive, very flirtatious, great to be around socially. So the fact that he allowed her to be part of court kind of shows that maybe she wasn't as ugly or as unattractive in general as sometimes she's legendarily known to be. And therefore, perhaps there's more to what exactly happened between the two of them. It could have been more based on cultural differences. Maybe she was less attractive to him because of her lack of understandings of certain English customs and expectations. Perhaps she just wasn't as attractive to him as he would have expected her to be. Or perhaps some of it came back to his inability to perform at the time. Maybe there's some shame that went along with it, who knows, but it was a very interesting video. I will see if I can find it and remember to link it down below if you're interested. But anyway, the book I'm going to go for this prompt is Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan. This is a book I have not discussed very much on this channel, but it is one that I really, really enjoyed. This story basically follows a man who is hard on his luck. I think it's during a recession, and he's lost his job. He's struggling to find a new one. And he ends up being hired in this bookstore, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, where he starts to notice some strange things going on, some strange customers coming in asking for strange things, and it's a really fascinating book that really delves into kind of the magic almost of technology. And it just is so much more whimsical and mysterious and kind of odd than I was expecting, but it's so beautiful and wonderful, and it's definitely one I wish more people would read. Actually, I also considered putting Sourdough by Robin Sloan, the other book by this author, on this list as well for this prompt, because it also surprised me, but I think I like this one a little bit better than Sourdough, which is why I chose it. But both of them are just really fascinating and just kind of add a little bit of oddity and magic to intelligence, different kinds of intelligence, both with technology as well as with books, and it's just wonderful. Even cooking in Sourdough, there's a little bit of magic that goes into the cooking in that book, and it's just, yeah, they're really fun, really great reads, and not very long. So if you want something whimsical and fun and a little bit mysterious, definitely pick this one up. Question 5, Katherine Howard, pick a book that irritated you. Now, Katherine Howard is actually not one that irritates me. In fact, I more feel sorry for her. If I'm being honest, I have not read any like historical fiction about Katherine Howard, so maybe the way she's portrayed in certain historical fiction might bother me in some ways or irritate me. But from what I've learned about her through documentaries and things like that, I just feel a lot of pity for her because she's so young. She's like a teenager who was abused by multiple men. And obviously she suffered a lot of trauma and her cognitive development is probably impacted by that. Of course, we don't know for sure everything that happened, but there's enough evidence to suggest that she was being abused and manipulated by men, and that women, older women in her life, were allowing this to happen. So it makes sense to me that she ended up making really bad decisions and not understanding consequences. And honestly, it sometimes bothers me when people accuse her of like being so like mistreating Henry, when I'm like, Henry was like at least 20 years older than her. I don't even remember how old he was when he married her, but she was like 17 and he was like 40 something. So like, sorry, but if he's that like affected by this little 17-year-old who's been emotionally and probably sexually abused throughout her life, like, I'm sorry, but that's his problem. Like, I would feel bad for him. Like, I'm sure she didn't treat him very nicely, but again, she's 17. So yeah, I don't really feel too bad for Henry as far as that whole thing goes. I do on some level, because he's just you get the feeling at this point that he's just trying to settle down with someone, and he ends up having yet another wife who ends up betraying him and not being quite right for him. But again, this is his 5th wife as well. So like, you know, if you have a lot of relationships that don't work out, like, what's the common denominator? It's you. So, yeah, anyway, so I've heard people say that they like are irritated by Katherine Howard and feel like she mistreated Henry, but again, I just feel like the age difference kind of negates that idea a little bit in my head. But anyway, the book that irritated me was Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. Reading this, I just ended up being really irritated by the end. I just felt like I didn't care about any of the characters. I felt like everybody was so selfish, and the ending felt like it was just sad for no real reason. And so, I don't know, this book just felt kind of pointless to me in my mind. I mean, I'm sure some people get certain things out of it. I'm sure people have analyzed it for different symbolism and things like that, but to me, it just was a pointless story. And originally I actually was considering possibly rereading it in the future, but the more I've thought about it, the more I'm like, I don't feel like I want to waste my time with that. So I'm actually intending on getting rid of this copy next time I do an unhaul. So anyway, that's gonna happen, but yeah, didn't love this book at all. And question 6 is associated with Katherine Parr, of course. And her question is to pick a book that was published after the author's death. I have mixed feelings about Katherine Parr. There are some things she did and stood for that I really appreciated. I appreciated that she tried to bring Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession and really tried to use her influence with Henry to help them. I also appreciate her strength of character when it came to, I feel like in some ways she is similar to Jane Seymour, but a little bit more outspoken and strong. She's a good balance, I almost think, between like Katherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour, where she is very loyal, she wants to do what's right, she wants to step into the background when she can just to avoid getting into trouble, but she is a little bit more willing to speak her mind than Jane Seymour seem to, at least in the time that she was alive as queen. And that does get her into some almost unfortunate situations, but she ends up being saved and then outlives Henry. However, all that being said, there is some level of evidence that she allowed her other husband, her husband after Henry, to sexually abuse Elizabeth and possibly even engaged in it herself. We don't really know for sure, but there's enough evidence that her husband was doing that, and clearly she didn't do anything about it. That is just very concerning. Obviously, that being said, I can't really like hate her for it, because even though it does sicken me, like I understand that time period and being in a state of power, especially like there were just certain expectations and lack of understanding about psychology and other things that would make it really hard for her to do much. However, it's really hard for me to really love her because of that whole situation. So in honor of that, I decided to go with a book that was published after the author's death that I also have similarly mixed feelings about, and that is The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. This was actually her first written work, but it was not published until after her death, even though she kept fighting to get it published throughout her life, or at least throughout her writing career. And I feel like I enjoyed it more than a lot of people do. I feel like there's a lot of people who really don't like it or just really feel meh about it. I felt like there were things I enjoyed about it, even though the main character is really obnoxious and just really, just irritating in his opinions about women especially. He's very judgmental and opinionated in ways that I just didn't really appreciate, but I feel like the overall story had some interest to it. I feel like there were a lot of similarities with VIII, but because this one's shorter, it was a little bit more faster paced and a little bit tighter of a plot than VIII has, which honestly I appreciated. So even though I didn't love it, I do, like I said, I feel like I enjoyed it and was entertained by it more than a lot of other people are. And like I said, it was published after her death, so that works for this question. And the bonus prompt goes with Henry VIII himself, and the prompt is a chunky book that you hated, which I think is such a hilarious prompt for Henry VIII. I will say Henry VIII is a figure that overall I don't really like. I don't really appreciate him. I don't think I would get along with him in person in real life. But I also think it's dangerous to characterize historical figures as straight evil. I think that Henry VIII was a very power-aware king. He knew what power he had and he was willing to manipulate it and stretch it to its limits, really. I also have a theory that he might have had ADHD just based on some of the stories and stuff I've heard about him. I just feel like ADHD would make a lot of sense. I just feel like he was very energetic, that he had a very difficult time focusing on anything. He didn't like paperwork, he wanted to be out doing things. So I get the feeling that he might have been a little bit on the ADHD spectrum somewhere. That was just a side tangent. But anyway, basically I feel like I wouldn't get along with him. I think I'd struggle a lot with him personally. But he's also a person, and there's also some level of pity for him that he really struggled in his marriages. Granted, like I said earlier, he's the common denominator, so like obviously there was something he was doing not quite right that made the relationships not work out quite right. But for this prompt, I decided to go with a book that I don't hate, and I actually would like to reread it in the future because I think I could like it better at a different time. But it is one I didn't really like, and it is a chunkier work, and that is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I really liked the beginning of this. I started off really liking it, and then it just lost me. But I did listen to it on audiobook, and I feel like that did it a disservice. I feel like it's one that I need to physically read slowly in order to at least enjoy more than I did the first time. Most of the time, if I read a chunky book, I actually really like it. Like the majority of huge books I've read, I've really loved, or at least enjoyed decently. So this prompt was kind of hard, but like I said, this one's one I didn't hate, but it wasn't my favorite. So I just ended up landing on this one for this prompt. And that is it. Those are my answers. This video was way longer than I thought it was going to be. But anyway, I'm going to tag 3 people. I'm going to tag my Ancients-a-thon co-hosts, so Jennifer Brooks and David Wiley, just because I think it would be fun to see them do this. And then I'm also going to tag Jackie from Jackie Reads and Writes, as she really is interested in the Tudors as well. And I would love to hear her thoughts on these prompts as well as just on the queens themselves. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, your thoughts on them. Also, if you have any specific answers that come to mind for any of these prompts, I would love to know. As well as your opinions and thoughts on the queens and Henry VIII himself, because I just feel like it's a very interesting time that we have just enough information about these people to form opinions, but not enough to really know for certain a lot of things. So yes, anyway, thank you again for watching. Let me know if you're having a good Ancients-a-thon as well, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!